Part 3 of Puppets of Pandemonium. Pardon the interruption. I'll start here. Print journalists have traditionally been accomplices in the mass violence. Television journalists have gone a step further. They have become instigators of the violence. Highly respected CBS reporter Daniel Shore, who started his career with Edward R. Murrow and reported on everything from the Soviets and the CIA to Watergate, confesses that most of us in television understood but did not like to think about it, the symbiotic relationship between our medium and violence. In the mid-1960s, covering urban unrest for CBS, I perceived that television placed a premium on violence and the threat of violence. I found that I was more likely to get on the CBS Evening News with a black militant talking the language of burn, baby, burn, than with moderates appealing for a Marshall Plan for the ghetto. So I spent a lot of time interviewing militants like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown. In early February 1968, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. came to Washington to announce plans for a Poor People's March on Washington in the spring. It was envisaged as a challenge to America's social conscience, at a time when the Vietnam War was escalating. The civil rights community was sharply divided over whether the campaign should be completely peaceful or resort to disruptive action. The unlicensed demonstrations and blocking the bridges into the Capitol. Dr. King was having trouble sustaining his policy on nonviolence. On February 6th, the evening before his planned news conference, the civil rights leader expressed his despair to a rally. "I can't lose hope, because when you lose hope, you die." Only dimly aware of the pressures on Dr. King, I came to his news conference with a CBS camera crew prepared to do what TV reporters do: get the most threatening sound bite I could in order to ensure a place on the evening news lineup. I succeeded in eliciting from him phrases on the possibility of disruptive protests directed at the Johnson administration and Congress. As I waited for my camera crew to pack up, I noticed that Dr. King remained seated behind the table in an almost empty room, looking depressed. Approaching him, I asked why he seemed so morose. "Because of you," he said, "and because of your colleagues in television. You try to provoke me to threaten violence, and if I don't, then you will put on television those who do. By putting them on television, you elect them our leaders. And if there's violence, will you think of your part in bringing it about?" I was shaken, but not enough to keep me from excerpting the news conference film from the evening news. I never saw Dr. King again. Less than 2 months later, he was assassinated. Wow. Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, was an early pioneer of the kind of not-so-subtle moral corruption of the press that I constantly bumped my nose against during my 15 years working with journalists. Swift came along at just that time when coffee had been introduced to London. The stuff became a rage and made men unbelievably jumpy and talkative. So they gathered to work off their energies by gossiping in a hot new form of eatery or drinkery: the coffee house. Out of the coffee houses and the men who entered them to swap political and economic tidbits came another pair of fashionable new items: the newspaper and the magazine. The news broadsheet had already been around for nearly 200 years, as had the pamphlet, which had been around for nearly 200 years. As had the pamphlet, which Christopher Columbus used to good effect after he got back from America. in which Martin Luther tossed around like dynamite to set off a cultural avalanche in Europe. At any rate, Swift made it from Ireland to London just in time to cash in on the power of the newborn press to sway public opinion and to make or break political careers. One of the most influential politicians when Swift arrived was Robert Walpole, 1st Earl of Orford, a man accustomed to doing things in the old way. He was smooth as a mink at making connections in court circles. But he would by no means lower himself to hobnob with these ghastly writers, swamping their stomachs with coffee. So though Walpole met with Swift once, he treated him rather rudely. Swift retaliated by writing a broadsheet filled with phony allegations that ran the man who'd spurned him through the muck and helped to permanently damage his reputation. Sounds familiar. On the other hand, Walpole's leading political opponent, Robert Harley, 1st Earl of Oxford, could see a promising new possibility when it raised its head. He met regularly with Swift, leaked torrents of news to him, solicited his advice on major decisions, and made him feel like a co-conspirator, a partner in the process of government. Of course, he also hid vast amounts of fact from Swift, something Jonathan never seems to have caught on to. This swelled Swift's ego like a blimp, and our boy Jonathan wrote reams of prose that made Harley look like an indispensable mainstay of the state. The newspapers of the American colonies weren't any better. They went into fits of hysteria when the British tried to get the colonists to pay part of the cost of the English troops which had been defending Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania against the French and the Indians. Why did the press block the minor taxes the Brits levied out on all proportion? Hold up. Why did the press blow the minor taxes the Brits levied out of all proportion and help precipitate a revolution? Why? Because the method of taxation the English chose raised the cost of paper and shaved a few farthings off publishers' profits. Meanwhile, one of Benjamin Franklin's first journalistic forays was a virulent attack on cotton mather. What was Franklin lacing into mather for? Advocating a controversial technique for the prevention of the smallpox epidemics that continually ravaged the colonial cities? The method Mather favored was an early version of inoculation. Franklin's unresearched diatribes helped kill off thousands of innocents. Nothing much has changed since then. Ah, how heroic is the press in a free society. Back in the 19th century, when something like 11 newspapers were fighting ferociously for circulation in New York City, a young part-time journalist named Edgar Allan Poe carried out a secret mission for the New York Sun. He wrote up a group of British adventurers who had built a propeller-driven balloon, had taken off to cross the English Channel, run into contrary winds, and had been blown across the Atlantic to a beach in Virginia, thus effecting the first aerial transatlantic crossing. This was big news. The Sun's unnamed correspondent was the first to reach Virginia's coast and interview the intrepid airmen about their perilous flight across the ocean. The Sun ran news stories about the balloonist adventures on the front page every day, and circulation leaped mightily, leaving New York's remaining papers in the dust. So all of them sent reporters down to Virginia and began cranking out their own exclusive interviews with the Brits. There was only one small problem. There was no... There was no balloon. No balloonist. And no transatlantic crossing. But the papers were no more concerned with the truth than they'd been in Ben Franklin's day. They just wanted a hot story. And even if they had to make it up by rewriting what had appeared someplace else. When Fidel Castro launched one of his Keystone comedy-style invasions of Cuba, his rather rusty ship got bogged down in the mangrove roots about a mile offshore, so it was impossible to unload the supplies and ammunition. Castro's men, all 30 or so of them, had to wade 5,270 feet in water up to their necks to get ashore, seriously moistening their gunpowder and their weapons in the process. By the time they reached the beach, they were exhausted. Then Batista's groups spotted them as they crawled inland and managed to wipe out all but 3, Castro and 2 others. The trio of survivors took refuge in a cane field, but the Batista troops knew they were in there somewhere. So they combed one row of cane after another, while Fidel and his 2 companions lay still on their bellies and avoided even a belch or a whisper to elude detection. Then the Batista folks got fed up and started to set the fields on fire. Unfortunately for history, they missed the one in which Fidel and his somewhat diminished army of 2 were ensconced. That night, when the Batista boys decided to get some sleep, Fidel counted heads, which took about half a second, and inventoried his arsenal. There was 1 rifle left. The future savior of Cuba, poor Cuba, was elated. He spent the rest of the night lecturing his unfortunate duo of followers. The theme of his exuberant, though hushed, oration: "We have won the revolution." I am not kidding. Neither was Fidel. How ironic that this real-life Ayn Randian hero turned out to be a Leninist monster. But you haven't heard the last of Fidel yet. Once the wily leader had escaped the sugar field, he managed to triple the size of his army, bringing it up to a grand total of 7. Then some of his supporters persuaded the New York Times to send a reporter down to the Sierra Madres for a week of interviews. Fidel ordered his men to change costumes and identities every hour or 2, then report for duty, supposedly as the heads of massive brigades camped out in the neighboring hills. Each time one of his septet reappeared as a supposedly different member of the Revolutionary Corps. The entrant would say something like, "Comrade Agente, I have 1,000 men stationed 3 miles away. Do you want me to move them closer to the urinals?" After 7 days of this, the New York Times reporter was convinced that the maximum leader had roughly 10,000 hard-bitten soldiers salted away among the pine trees, and that the revolutionary force was unbeatable. The scribe wrote this undisputable fact up in a highly touted series on the Cuban insurrection. Journalists, being an independent-minded lot, immediately scrambled to Cuba to replicate the Times scoop. Life, Look, and all 3 networks sent in their best reporters. Fidel repeated the costume-changing trick. The result, every media outlet in sight parroted the Times' conclusion that Fidel and his massive army had practically taken Cuba already. A year later, When Batista finally couldn't stand being made a fool of by the American press anymore, he decamped. Then the New Yorker ran a cartoon with a picture of Fidel and the caption, "I got my job in the New York Times." I doubt that many people understood the precision of the joke. Watch the weekend talk shows in which Washington reporters swap their insider data. Note the pools from which their data is gathered. Press conferences, not for attribution briefings, meaning more press conferences, and my sources, in other words. Each reporter is simply picking up scraps from that others have gathered for him or her and handed out on a platter. Not a one is reporting, with the exception of George Ann Geyer, who stays out of Washington. None is digging. None is going underground. None is moving from the level of what's offered for official presentation to the level of what's held in secrecy. None is piercing the veil, as I had to when researching my story on the kids of New York's private schools. Okay, granted that my story led to threats of ending my publishing career. The threats were made by some of the wealthiest and most influential men in the Big Apple, the core of the publishing world. The gentleman using phrases like, "You're putting your head in the noose, Mr. Bloom. We're on the boards of New York's most prestigious schools for the elite. But isn't wading your way through threats and attacks part of the job?" Granted that each Washington reporter knows that to retain access to press conferences, briefings, and sources, he or she must abide by a set of unwritten and shamefully unreported rules. Rules which seriously constrain what he or she can say. Also granted that without this access, a reporter would no longer have a standard Washington career. But whoever said that journalism is about following a standard pattern isn't reporting all about rule breaking to pierce the shroud and uncover what's really going on. Isn't reporting all about rule breaking to pierce the shroud and uncover what's really going on? Isn't it about discovering those well-kept secrets and soaring insights most likely to have an impact on our lives and explain the hows, what's, whens, wheres, and whys? If not you as a reporter, then who? And if not now, when? Karl Marx held that history is shaped by control of the means of production. In our times, history is shaped by control of the means of communication. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. He who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who executes statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes or decisions possible or impossible to execute. Abraham Lincoln. Wow. That was pretty deep, yeah, right there. I'm gonna read that again. Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. He who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who executes statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes or decisions possible or impossible to execute. Damn, Abraham Lincoln. Okay. It's not enough to invent something fantastic. You have to promote it. A 19th century Floridian, John Gary, trying to keep the town of Apalachicola's population from contracting a fever that racked the multitudes every summer. In 1850, Gary invented the refrigeration and air conditioning. Is that Gary or Gory? Invented refrigeration and air conditioning. Alas, the clever tinkerer was better at inventing than at promoting his invention. He was blind to the necessity of creating a climate of belief that gets all the members of a skittish herd moving in the same direction. Normal human beings are afraid of straying from the pack. Normal human beings are afraid of straying from the pack. They are frightened at the thought of finding merit in something they might be ridiculed for championing. Gary and his air conditioners were ridiculed by no less an authority than the writers of the New York Times. Oh, here we go. Is that the end of this part? Okay. Dang, Migos hating. You gonna be hating.